A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you for joining us for our January webinar. I have a very special guest, and so I'm going to briefly do an overview, and then inshallah we can get right into it very quickly, inshallah. As always, we start with the holy verses of the Quran. Since we're talking about Islamic psychology, this is a very famous ayah in Surah Ar-Ra'd, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about tatma'in al-qulub, having the hearts filled, or hearts who remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we can see in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeats it. He starts it with al-lazina. So he's making it a definite that it is these people who believe, who have faith, and whose hearts have become serene with remembrance of Allah, bi zikrillah. And then Allah says, undoubtedly, he repeats it again, that it is only the remembrance of Allah which brings hearts comfort. And this is interesting because this suggests that there will be times where our hearts are not in comfort, where we don't feel comfort, and to realize the different states, as the Quran mentions, that our heart can be in. And then people don't talk about the verses which come after. So the verse that comes after is again al-lazina. So there's a specification of this type. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, al-lazina amanu wa amilu salihat. So again, only believing is not sufficient. Amanu wa amilu salihat, those who do faith and good deeds, for them, Tuba lahum, for them is blessedness, wa husnun ma'ab, a beautiful place, a beautiful return. And this is echoed in the latter verse 30, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about other communities before us, those who we have sent among community before you, where we read to them, أما لتدل عليه الذي أوحينا إليهم وهم يكفرون بالرحمن. So it is talking about communities which did not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah is mentioning here that there were communities that were before us which did not have belief in Allah. And this links to, I guess, a little bit of the discussion we have today in terms of secularization, denying, kind of the, if you like, the Islamic approach of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the center of our sense of remembrance, sense of our heart. And again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions here, Qul huwa rabbi la ilaha illahu alayhi tawakkaltu wa ilayhi mat'ab. So say it is only him, it is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I trust, I have tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is again to him that I return. So again, this is concept of comfort of the heart. To do that, we need to believe, we need to do actions, we actually need to act, we need to do good deeds, and we need to remember that we will go back to him and that we trust him in that. So yes, I thought I'd start with these couple of verses. For those who may be new to us, we are essentially a peer support group for Muslims who struggle with sexual or gender identity. We offer free consultation for everyone, for Muslims, non-Muslims. We've had a variety of people come to us. We have support groups, which you can see here. There's some vacancies. And things like this, what we're doing now is educational webinar, inshallah, so we can talk more about this topic and inshallah with the benefit of great speakers like who we have today. So I'm very pleased to have Sheikhna. There's mashallah, when I think of counseling in Muslim and the work that he has done, Sheikhna has an Imam Diploma. He has Ijaza from Ijaza Aliyah in Islamic Studies from a European university. He also has a diploma in Arabic from Zarqa Private University, studied fiqh wa usuluhu, and received training from scholars in Jordan and the Middle East. He has a background of counseling in psychology. He's provided therapy for individuals, couples, and families for over a decade. He has many certificates in person-centered, which I'm studying at the moment, person-centered, as well as marriage and youth counseling. And I know he's a great fan of solution-focused based therapy as well. He's currently pursuing a doctorate in applied psychology. I think I remember because he's very busy. When I speak to him, he's saying, "Oh, I'm doing these studies," and he's doing a master's degree in the same field and a master's in medical psychology. He also has exposure to Zakat and philanthropic studies. Having done so much for the community, over 10 years of experience in managing these type of programs in the Third Center. He's currently the teacher of Islamic Psychology, which will introduce the PSCP program. He also provides counseling, chaplaincy counseling from multiple mosques in London. He has led several initiatives such as Imams Against Domestic Abuse. He sits in the BBSI, British Imam Scholars Achievements, the BISCA Awards, the British Institute Mosques and Association Awards. He is a member of, and inshallah we can talk about this, the Association of Islamic Mental Health Specialists, and contributes to other things. So mashallah, there's so much there, which I've kind of very briefly gone with. Now, as a prelude to this discussion, I think this is a fantastic article. It's in Muslim Matters. It's relevant to the discussion we're having today in terms of where we're talking about the history of psychotherapy, why we feel there's a need for an Islamic approach, what has been in the past, how do we see psychiatry, how do we see even therapy, and it's a very interesting critique on that. So I do recommend. It is a bit of a long read, but I tell you it is fascinating. The program which I referred to, which Sheikhna leads, is called the PSCP, the Professional Counseling Skills Program, and it's delivered online. It has a focus on skills, focus on actually acquiring practical skills, which I think is really good. And if you read the reviews, it's actually looking at the Islamic reference on how to do so. So it's not bereft of theory. It's applying the theory in a very practical way. And we need so much more of this. And I'm so happy that he is pioneering this. He is putting this forward. May Allah bless him. There's also the Muslim Psychologist Telegram channel, which I'm part of as well, and there's very interesting discussions. I think there was a discussion recently on gender, on using he, him, and so on. And I think, so there's different discussions there, a lot of resources, a lot of books, and so much to to gain from. Yes, so without further ado, because I know he's just come back from teaching and he's busy afterwards because mashallah he's doing so much. I want to hand it over to Sheikh now. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Ali, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, it's so good to have you. And I know we've been wanting to have this conversation for a while, and you've been busy with your doctorate, with your studies, with your teaching, and so much. So I'm so grateful that you've taken the time today to be with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, obviously, I kind of have seen your work from afar and close. The work that you're doing, alhamdulillah, very important, absolutely important work within the Muslim community. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to support you more. Just so busy, but
No, no,
the spiritual support is there, definitely, as you know, right?
no.
So yeah, the work that you're doing and the support you're providing the Muslim community, it's I can't kind of promote it enough. It's really important. So, barakallahu feekum.
Thank you so much. And actually, Sheikh is supporting me at the moment in a very essential way. And inshallah, we can talk about that more when those projects come into fruition. And what I wanted to discuss was that we'll have a lot of listeners here who might be counselors or who might be training to be counselors or um, and we have listeners here which may be struggling with sexuality, with gender, and they go to the secular counseling, and of course the narrative is completely different, as we know, and they're stuck. And I wanted to kind of see how you think, sexuality and gender is one issue, but there's so many other issues where we need to have the Islamic perspective to understand the client. I mean, even secular therapy would say you need to understand the background of the client and where they're coming from. But for topics such as sexuality and gender, which are so personal, it's very difficult for people to get help. And then we've identified that there's a lack of understanding of what Muslim psychotherapy is and what it looks like. So yeah, I wanted to start off with that premise. What are the gaps that you have seen so far in your work in terms of the secular approach and what we have, and then seeing when people use the secular approach for problems to do with their deen, sensitive topics. How have you seen that pan out in your experience?
Okay, Bismillah. Before we go into the specific area that you mentioned, I think it's important to touch upon it, definitely. And this is obviously a huge topic that we are trying to tackle. The article that we published on Muslim Matters is, I think, over 8,000 words. It's a bit of a long read. Tries to kind of open up discussions on many different areas in mental health. In psychology, in psychiatry, in psychotherapy, the little bit of history, the current state of play, and how things are being advanced within the mental health industry, and some of the problems that Muslims might face, not just Muslims, I think, but other ethnic minority groups might face. So the discussion really is not about Islam or Muslim, although Islam and Muslims have a unique approach to it from the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But the way psychology or psychologization of the society of the world has happened, there's a historical root to it, and there's a lot of discussion actually, even in academia, in among the non-Muslims, about decolonizing psychology, right? Because there is an understanding that psychology, as we understand it now, has certain philosophical, scientific, historical, ideological roots in Euro-American history. And in order for us to understand how to decolonize, we have to understand the history, right? And And going back actually more, we have to also understand what is colonization. I'm talking about the physical colonization. We know it's the area of interest for academics. There's been tons of books have been written, journal articles, alhamdulillah, I'm talking about even non-Muslims who are writing about this. So we know that in many Muslim countries, um, from European countries, they went in the Middle Eastern countries, the Muslim countries, and African countries, and physically colonized their nations, right? They uprooted their identity, they uprooted their ideology, uprooted their religion, right? How they see the world, how they view the world, and the physical uprootment about, just getting rid of the identity, removing their national identity, right? And imposing a Euro-American identity, whether it be, in Algeria, for example, the French, or, our own country, the UK, in India and other parts of the Muslim country. Along with the physical kind of colonization, there was obviously ideological colonization, right? As I alluded to earlier, about stripping away the identity and imposing Euro-American secular values in not only, the education system, the economic system, the political system, and that there was a very, massive paradigm shift within the Muslim countries, right? Especially after, obviously, the Muslim nations, they're not particularly strong. There's a massive paradigm shift, intellectual shift, economic shift, political shift, sociological shift in every sense of the word. And since then, obviously, many different countries, they've tried to, and they've come out of that shackle of colonization, at least the physical one. But the economic, the political, the educational, the intellectual, colonization, the shackles, unfortunately, in many countries are still there, right? So what happened during the colonization period, psychology had a big impact or big influence. Or, you had psychologists who were, developing a questionnaire, developing scientific methodologies, and trying to see, who is more developed, whose consciousness is more developed. Is it, the Euro-Americans, or the Asians, or the Black Africans, the Chinese, and whatnot? And there have been studies have done showed that actually these studies they demonstrated, according to their own standards, that the Asians and the Black Africans and others, their consciousness was not developed. They're at a lower bar than Euro-Americans. So, and you had, scientists and psychologists and experts claiming that, certain ethnic minorities, their brain was not evolved compared to others, that they were animalistic in their behavior, right? They were using these derogatory, terms to describe ethnic minorities, right? So psychology had that really dark past, and there's been, tons of books have been written on this, right? And for people to kind of get an understanding, you'll find articles online even just give you a window, a picture into what happened. Now, this obviously, unfortunately, in my opinion, has continued, but in a different way. It's continuing actually in a different way, even until upon the 90s, right? There were magazines, psychological magazines, were considering a writing article that, the Black community were less of human beings, essentially.
Yeah.
The brains were not developed, right? The consciousness was not developed, like of the Euro-American, right? But the colonization still is happening because vast majority of the psychological discourse in the West, in our country, in the UK, in America, in Europe, is from that rooted history, right? It's based on a secular worldview, based on certain ideologies, what I call arkan. We have in Islam the arkanul iman, right? We have the 6 articles of faith, right? Psychology has certain arkans or pillars of faith, if you like, right? Individualism, empiricism, right? Scientism, materialism, egoism, selfism. These are all articles of faith when it comes to psychology and psychotherapy and counseling. And another really important, we mentioned in the article, a bit of a history that we have to really understand. As you mentioned, that in order to understand a client, we have to understand the background, the context, right? In order to have a conversation with the client, right? Without that, then we'll be probably blind, right? How we do that, there are differences of opinion, right? According to different modalities, that's fine, but there has to be some understanding of the theology, the understanding the worldview. If we go back to European history, the UK, for example, right? Before the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, the society at large were governed by, priests and kings and queens. Europe was like that. No democracy. There's no parliamentary elections or voting, anything like that, right? The king, his word was the law, right? The king's word or the queen's word, their word was the law. So the socio-economic, political education, right? The spiritual affairs were governed by, in one sense, religion, right? Yes, there were a lot of problems, there were a lot of issues, but they were either Catholics or Protestants, based on, the Bible, right? So there was some positive, but obviously we know what happened. Unfortunately, as science began to develop, the Christian faith were viewed science in a very a skeptical way, right? To the point that we know, this is a brief history, that people were burning books, science books, and were killing, unfortunately, men and women and scientists, right? Islam does not have that history, alhamdulillah, but Islam advanced science and technology and so on and so forth, right? So when this was a paradigm shift, right? So before people would go to the masses, they would go to, for example, the priest, to the church, right? And they would speak about their week. There were any issues, anxieties, depression, anything that they had, they would want to go and confess, right? Want to talk about these issues with the priest, and the priest would have a conversation. The word counseling, that really counts from the Christian, the act of confessing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as science began to evolve, right, and psychology began to take deeper roots, there was a decline in, obviously, religion at a societal level, deen as a societal level, right? So whereas before, the politics, the economics, education, everything was governed in one way or another by deen, a metaphysical worldview. A worldview that is based on the belief in God, right? And belief in the hereafter. Science, psychology began to replace deen. So science replaced religion, right? And psychology and psychologists, therapists replaced, the role of the priest, right? And there's, researchers have mentioned that there is a kind of connection, at least, right? There's a connection, at least, between the decline of religion in Euro-American societies, right? And the kind of growth of science and the decline of the role of the priest in everyday life, and the kind of advancement and growth of psychotherapists, psychologists, and counselors, right? So, and since then, obviously, there's been a surge of scientific psychological studies. Institutions have been developed. In fact, in the UK, right, people who are considered mentally ill, right, they were not treated as human beings. Now, they were treated as, witches. They were treated as, animals. We know in the asylums what happened, right? Even kind of medical doctors, they didn't want to get involved that much, right? But what happened was that there was another paradigm shift when certain parliamentary acts took place, and the government were, pushing money into asylums and to build hospitals for the mentally ill, certain institutions and certain professions, there's some money to be made, right? So, and then they got involved, right? So it is important for us to understand this issue. I know I'm simplifying it. I don't have time to go into the details. It is important for us to understand that. So what is happening now, even in the Muslim countries? So in the 1950s and 60s, we had people like Professor Malik Badri, rahimahullah, passed away last year. Right, he's considered by some the father of modern Islamic psychology. Right, whatever that means. Right, but he's done tremendous efforts in decolonizing psychology. Right, and he saw that look, in the Arab countries like Egypt, for example, in Sudan and Saudi Arabia and other places, you had psychologists or Muslims who were just importing the psychology of Freud, psychology of Carl Jung, psychology of B.F. Skinner, and so on and so forth, and without doing a filtering process, right? Just carbon copying and imposing on the Muslims. And he was saying this is really dangerous, this is really harmful. And he began to write books, he began to talk, he began to lecture. So may Allah reward him for that, right? Unfortunately, his work, right, has had a big impact. But unfortunately, we are seeing the problem he faced even in our times. Yeah. So now we have this field called Islamic Psychology and Counseling, right? In order to define Islamic psychology and counseling, and that's another whole discussion, right? But again, I feel that most of the literature, a lot of the people who are trying at least in this area to teach quote unquote Islamic psychology and counseling is essentially taking the Western secular framework, the epistemology, and window dressing with verses and hadith, right? It's not essentially Islamic psychology.
It's
I mean,
not
in a simple way,
not rooted in our literature, or it doesn't have root within our view and framework.
it doesn't have roots in our our kind of discursive text, the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi. There's a lot of, I think, there's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of kind of disservice that's being done within in the tradition, fortunately. I mean, one of the reasons is because a lot of people who are engaged at that level, right, are not grounded in Islamic theology, are not grounded in the tradition of Islam, right? And those perhaps who are even grounded, right, they do not really, as far as I can see, in their works, appreciate the historical roots, the ideological roots, right, the theological roots of psychology. Because psychology is an ideology. Like, it's a science, but we know the history, even psychological science. Among non-Muslim experts, not everyone agrees with psychological science. Not everyone agrees with a thing called psychological science. There's been a lot of people who reject it. They say it's not. As an example, right? It's based on kind of questionnaires and measures that we come up with. There's no kind of distinct, specific, identifiable markers. Like we have, when we talk about mental illness, right, and other illnesses, right, other bodily and physical illnesses like cancer, like diabetes, like those other illnesses we know of, right? There are medical markers or biomarkers, they say, right? You go to a doctor, you complain of something, right? The doctor will say, how do you feel about this? The GP I'm talking about. If it persists, obviously, they will do a blood test, right? They will probably do an MRI scan. They'll do all sorts of scans, right? I know, right? I went through some of them, right? And my late mother went through so many different tests, right? And they, and medicine has advanced, greatly. Yes, there are issues, but medicine has advanced in the last 100 years, right? In a superb way, right? In 100 years ago, someone catching polio or similar diseases, right? The chance of survival was 20%. or less than that. Now it's probably 80%, 90% because of medicine, right? But when you go to a psychiatrist, you complain, I've got depression and I've got this, I've got schizophrenia and whatnot, right? It's just, questionnaires. There's no blood test. There's no scans, although they spent billions of pounds, right? In one study, again, I'm not exactly sure about the exact number, but between the 80s or the 70s or 80s and until now, right? Tens of billions of pounds of was spent on this research, trying to find a biomarker, trying to find MRI scans of the brain and whatnot to find the cause of or biological cause of a depression, and they haven't found it yet. And I don't think they will find it, but it's not rooted in the physical bodily disease, right? So that comes to our discussion when I know I'm trying to cover so many different things. That comes to our discussion. Okay, what happened, right? So before you had, even not just in the Euro-American societies, but in other societies, right? There was a concept of counseling. There was a concept of people going to the wise, person in the community, the knowledgeable person, right? And seeking advice. And we have that within Islam also, right? So in that sense, we had counseling, and we definitely have psychology because psychology is part of life. God created us. Allah created us. He knows our biology because He created us. He knows our psychology. Why do we do what we do? He knows our desires. He knows us more than we know ourselves. He knows us intimately, right? So we have a concept of psychology and counseling, definitely. But that's very different from the psychology and counseling that we have at the moment in Western epistemology and psychology. So what happened, there's another paradigm shift, right? So well before, many different societies, people would view these certain struggles, whether it be, grieving, right? Or if you want to, I'm using the word depression in quotation marks, right? Or similar anxiety, distress, and so on and so forth, right? People view that as, as Thomas Shaz, he explained, a psychiatrist, right? Problems in living. These are problems that human beings face due to a myriad of reasons: poverty, politics, environment, and so on and so forth. Right? Of course, someone's loved one passes away, they will be grieving, right? They will be sad, right? Definitely. The Prophet ﷺ, when his son passed away, he was sad, right? The scholars in the Sirah, they call it that year Amul Huzn, the year of sadness, because his uncle passed away, protected him, his beloved wife Khadija radiallahu anha, passed away. So even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right, he faced these human emotions, sadness, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mentioned that He consoled him in one of the very powerful verse in the Quran. Allah consoles the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمُ أَنَّكَ يَضِيقُ صَدْرُكَ بِمَا يَقُولُونَ. Oh Prophet Muhammad, we see in counseling terms, right? We hear your pain because what they are saying about you, right? But don't worry about what they are saying, right? We know what is happening. We are with you, right? We are your supporters. We are your aid, right? We meaning Allah, because we is a royal plural, right? فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَكُن مِّنَ السَّاجِدِينَ. Glorify the praise of your Lord in the morning and the evening. And submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Don't care about what they say, because they're not upon guidance. You are upon guidance. And be among those who submit and continue on that path. You will face struggles and difficulties and challenges. حَتَّى يَأْتَيَكَ الْيَقِينُ. Until death comes to you. We know the story of Ayyub alayhi salam. Ayyub alayhi salam, subhanallah, how his story is so powerful. His story is transformative, right? He went through poverty, physical bodily illness. His community, family deserted him, except his wife. He was wealthy. He lost every single thing, right? You can imagine, right? He lost everything. And then he goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah mentioned in the Quran, وَأَيُّوبَ إِذْ نَادَى رَبَّهُ أَنِّي مَسَّنِيَ الضُّرُّ وَأَنْتَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ. The reason I'm talking about that as human beings will go through trials and tribulations. Allah mentioned in the Quran, حَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا. Do people believe that just because they assume that just because they believe they will not be tested? Indeed, we have tested the people before them to see who among them will be truthful and not truthful, right? So the point out, reason I'm mentioning is that the prophets and the messengers, us, everyone will face trials and tribulations, will face sadness, will face, depression, will face all of these human reactions to circumstances, right? So before, that was dealt with in a particular way. People will go to the priest, people go to the imam, people go to the shaman, wise people within the society, in the village, and they would have a conversation. And obviously, they have different society, community, they have different, should I say, treatments or approaches to support their people or their clients, right? And even Freud, right? Pre-Freud, this was the case, right? So psychoanalysis is not from a medical perspective. It's more, about looking at, trauma, looking at childhood development and so on. So I'm not saying I agree with that, but again, it was very different from what we have now. Even the DSM. So where do we get our understanding from of mental illness, right? Right. What happened was, I know I'm simplifying it, in Europe, in America, for example, right? Psychologists, right? There was a clash. No, I'm simplifying. There was a clash between psychologists and medical doctors. The medical doctors were really frowning upon and looking down upon the psychologists and even psychiatrists. Freud was a psychiatrist, but his psychiatry was very different from the psychiatry that we have now. Very different, right? But they were looked down upon because you go to a group of psychologists at that time and say, okay, this person has depression. But you go to another group of experts, they will say, no, this person does not have depression, right? And they felt that, okay, we need to make it, we need to have a common language. We need to have a universal language. Like we have in the medical field, we have a common language, otherwise people will be laughing at us, right? So there was a movement. So they developed DSM. DSM-1, DSM-2, and DSM-3, right? The DSM essentially was a manual of diagnosing people's mental illness. They had certain criteria. And how did that happen? A group of men, mainly European or American men, in America, for DSM was established, right? 10, 13, they got together in a room and they discussed, I have this client and this client suffers from this. I think that person's got depression. I've got this client, I think that person's got schizophrenia. This person got that. Do you see? Right? And they voted. Dr. James Davis, in his book, a couple of his books, he articulates that, right? And they essentially voted in what is depression, who has depression, whatnot. And he mentioned that the scientific endeavor, the medical endeavor, it should not be about voting. It should be about facts. Right? It should be about facts. In medicine, you don't have that, essentially, right? So as I mentioned, when a client goes to a psychiatrist, there's no test, blood test, blood pressure or anything like generally, right? If the person does not have any underlying bodily diseases or physical problem. So they developed the DSM-1. The DSM-1, DSM-2, the DSM-3, again, was based generally on a psychoanalysis, about looking at relationships, looking at this, right? And then in DSM-3, DSM-4, another paradigm shift took place, 1972 or 70s, right? The pharmaceutical companies came in, right? To cut the long story short, they saw that there's some money to be made to diagnose people so we can prescribe them pills, right? So psychiatrists were essentially bought, right? There's a lot of conflict of interest in the committee members of the DSM-3, DSM-4 particular, right? Even DSM-5. Recently, there was a study by a group of researchers in DSM-5, which was published in 2013, right? 90% of the board members of DSM-5 had financial ties with pharmaceutical companies. 90 or 92%. I mean, look, you can imagine, right? Of course, that will sway the investigation, the opinions, and and views. So the DSM-3, DSM-4, a paradigm shift took place, right? Whereas before, these problems were, in a way, in Thomas Scheiser's word, right, problems in living. They're experiential, they're relational, right? Now, it's a medical issue. It's a biological issue. A depression is there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, chemical imbalance in the low serotonin. And obviously, the serotonin hypothesis, right, has been refuted. In fact, even when it was proposed, many psychiatrists, good psychiatrists, right, they were against it, right? Many of them were against it. And we know, I think last year, or 2 years ago, Dr. Joanna Moncrief in the UK and a group of researchers did an umbrella study, right? It's not new, nothing new, it's already there, right?
Yeah.
The funny thing was, I mentioned this in the article, that when this came out, a lot of the psychiatrists, they came out, and I've had discussions with psychiatrists. We knew about this anyway. We don't believe in that. We go by the biopsychosocial model, whatever that means to them, right? But even the biopsychosocial model, the emphasis is the bio. Even though they may say they're psychosocial and also spiritual, but the emphasis is the biological, right? And it's very difficult to get out of that, right? Our whole, the NHS, education systems, everything is based on that, based on the DSM, or in the UK, the ICD, right? It's the biological model. So again, a paradigm shift took place, right? People began to view people who were suffering from psychological problems in living, right, from a medical lens, right? Even the chair of DSM-4, Dr. Alan Francis, I actually did a podcast with him, right? He came and now he's critical of that, and he was the chair of the DSM-4, right? And it was probably a kind of like tongue in cheek, but he said, when asked, what is mental illness? What is mental illness? And he said, you can't really define it, right? It's, excuse my French, it's BS.
Yeah.
And he was the chair of DSM-4, right? And there are many others, psychiatrists who understand the history, understand the problematic nature of psychiatry, right? In the UK, there's Joanna Moncrief, Professor Ali Tamimi, right, and others, James Davis, although they're psychiatrists, like psychologists, right? I mean, I think it's a growing number. It's a growing number. BPS, for example, they're very different from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, right? So there is a growing number, alhamdulillah. It's not a minority. I think it's a majority in one sense, right? In America, in the UK, and European countries, right? I'm not saying I agree with that approach in terms of the BPS and whatnot from the exam perspective, but at least they're tackling the dark aspects of psychiatry, right? So what is happening, unfortunately, among the Muslim community is a lot of researchers, some people are teaching it even, they're taking the Western epistemology and the framework, the psychology, right? And they're adding certain verses and certain teachings here and there, scaffolding and plastering, right? It's like, why don't we have, some even saying, why don't we have Islamic cognitive behavior therapy? Why don't we have Islamic psychoanalysis? Why don't we have Islamic so on and so forth? I mean, analogy I can give maybe not be appropriate. It's like, then why don't we have Islamic Christianity? Why don't we have Islamic communism?
Yeah.
Right? Yes, there are some aspects of Christianity that we agree with, right? Definitely, because the teachings are based on a metaphysical reality, right? But the framework, right, the epistemology is very, very different.
That's
right?
right.
We shouldn't argue for Islamic cognitive behavior therapy, right? And if we really understand the history and the theology and the ideology and the science, they wouldn't really know science, right? Then you see, people will see that it's problematic, right? So I think what we need to, so this is what's happening. That's why the courses that I've developed, right? So the LIPC, the Licensed Islamic Professor Counselor, right? It's a diploma for, general Muslim community, but in particular, psychotherapy, psychologists who are trained in the Western paradigm. So to give a window into the Islamic, perhaps, paradigm, right? I tried to work with different universities, and it's a master's level program, right? I approached and I had meetings with universities in the UK, and they really liked it. I didn't go ahead with it because two reasons. Number one is very expensive because they want to charge a lot. Number two is that you will not be able to discuss a number of things from the Islamic perspective. Yeah, we're talking about mental health industry. The mental health industry, psychiatry in many sense, and psychology in many sense, right? They work like a mafia, right? Like the moment that you criticize psychiatry, right? You're anti-psychiatry, meaning it's a derogatory term, right? It's anti-psychiatry, then you're bad, right? No other area, but I mean, even in medicine, in psychotherapy, right? People criticize psychotherapy. Psychotherapists criticize psychotherapy. Psychology, right? That enriches the discourse, right? But we don't. Have you ever seen, I mean, for the listeners, like someone or a group of people labeled you're anti-psychotherapy?
No.
You're anti-psychology? No.
No.
It's only in psychiatry. There's, and I've discussed with a lot of psychiatrists. There are really good ones out there. I mentioned some names, right? A lot of psychiatrists, they're not researchers. The psychiatrists are medically trained. A lot of them are not trained in psychology or psychotherapy, right? In a deep way.
Yeah.
In a deep way. The medical professor, what's his name in America? He was the president of APA once. Peter Breggin. Yeah, he mentioned that, and he's a psychiatrist, and he's very critical, right? He's written so many different books, right? He mentioned that why are psychiatrists talking about mental health? Why?
Yes.
They're medically trained.
Yes.
Right.
It's true. It's like we have this concept that, if it's really bad, then you go to the psychiatrist, isn't it? This kind of like leveling up. It's talking therapy, but psychiatry. But actually, that field is just about labels. It's just about putting labels, which are based on very old science, which probably doesn't.
I mean, it's not
anymore.
We talk about DSM. I mean, this people might say, "Oh, this is a very harsh," but it's not. This is by the everything I said, I'm not saying it. There's even non-Muslim secular experts are saying it.
Yeah.
Right. It's not. I'm saying it as a Muslim. Everything I'm saying, I only touched up on certain elements, right? Non-Muslims, atheist secularists are saying, right? The DSM is a colonial tool. DSM, it's not a scientific. Right? In the article, I give you analogies. It's like Harry Potter, right? It may have. I mean, I'm not saying it's completely irrelevant, right? It's not completely irrelevant, but the way it's being used, right, is very problematic, right? That's one of the problems, that the way it's being used is very, very problematic. And a lot of diagnosing people, and providing label. Even actually, a lot of experts during the formation of DSM, they didn't agree with it. They said, it's not a science. You can't do it. They said it's more of an art than a science.
Yeah.
Some experts, they disagree. They were vehemently against developing a DSM, a manual. They said it's an art rather than a science.
And it's become so political now, isn't it? That anything that, like, for example, gender dysphoria, which was in the DSM now, and it makes sense to be in the DSM because if somebody is unhappy with their body, well, that is, that can be thought of as an illness, but now that's been pushed off because, it's not politically correct. So
you cannot demarcate, separate politics, economics from mental health. Right? The mental health industry, there's a lot of problems. It's the individualization of mental health. What I mean by that is that, and this is part of the colonial project, that many people in the UK, and the roots come from a community-led community, right? Meaning community-based society, where it's not the individual, but what happens outside of the individual, the family system, right? The society and whatnot. Now you have why is CBT very popular in the NHS, as an example? Why is certain therapy very popular? You have to look at the economics, you have to look at the politics, right? You can't go into it. It's politics and it's economics, right?
Yes.
But when you diagnose people, when you label people that they have chemical imbalance, they have this dysphoria, they have this problem, that this disease, that disease, the problem is within them. The problem is not outside. So the responsibility of government, responsibility of other institutions, they can say it's not our responsibility, right? You have people, there have been research in a community where it's abject poverty. Poverty, there's crime, there's no kind of good policing, education, and so on and so forth, right? People are barely surviving, right? Of course, they will be sad and depressed, right?
Yes.
But when they go and complain, no, take a pill, right? Take a pill and it will remove your worry. But even, right? But that will not remove the worry, because the problem of poverty, the problem of lack of education, good water, right? Society and whatnot, it still remains. They still have the problem. So it is political, and we can't demarcate, you can't separate mental health discussion, right? 90%, 80% is politics. 80 to 90% is politics, economics. So what these approaches to psychology and psychotherapies is that they take away responsibility from the community and society, and they make the individual the problem. When you problematize the people, right, and you don't deal with their root causes, their root issues, right, and of course there will be increase in prescribing of antidepressants. Yeah, of course people will be continuing to take drugs, yeah, psychiatric drugs, yeah, antipsychotics and so on and so forth, right? Because the root causes, root problems are not understood, right? And they're not being dealt with. So there is an economic or political, side to it that we cannot forget. I mean, look what's happening in certain parts, Gaza, for example, and other parts. Some Muslims are applying the same Western epistemology in them, right? People are being killed and bombed, right? We know what the problem is. When your family is being massacred in front of you, of course you will feel depressed and PTSD and whatever maybe you want to put it. But now there are people going to know there might be a chemical imbalance in your brain. There might be an issue. You see, it's very important for us to understand. What I feel is that a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, or I've not come across talking about these things in the Muslim community, right? Whether it be psychology, psychiatrists, and whatnot, right? And this is widespread, like common knowledge in the wider society, in fact. But the Muslim community, it seems that we are playing catch up. We're 20 years behind. Yeah. So the purpose of what I'm trying to do with the LIPC course, with the PCSP course, is more so it's looking at, for example, the theory, the psychology, the Islam theory, and focusing on giving skills to people who don't have any counseling background. Yes, we can take certain modalities, or we can take certain interventions from Western secular psychotherapies. There's no harm in that. But how do we do that? Who does that? That's a really long discussion. So this course, what I feel is that we have over 80, 90 students worldwide studying. There are already some students who have done it, right? And they are practicing. They have clients and they are practicing, right? So the course, once a person does this, right, they can help and support a person in whatever issues that they come, in whatever issues, right, they come with these skills, right? Obviously, the more one practices, the more one gains knowledge, the better they will be. But after doing this, if they pass, they will be able to support a person in whatever issue that they come with. The other point I forgot to mention, I think, come back to the work that you're doing. DSM, to give an example, it is political. So, and we have to be careful how we say what we say, unfortunately, right? But this is an academic discussion, right? More than anything else. So in 1972 or 73, before that, in the DSM, the homosexuality was considered by scientists, by psychologists, psychiatrists, right, as an illness. There was a label given, right? And then you had lobbying by certain groups and individuals, right? And literally overnight, that diagnosis, that label was removed. And it was not due to because scientific discoveries or anything like that, right? So you rightly said it's a political instrument. It's a political tool, right? And we know that, knowledge, as even Western philosophers have mentioned, right? Um, um, Knowledge, right? How we receive knowledge, yeah, whether it be scientific or non-scientific, right? Is really connected to politics as well as the power, right? I mentioned in the article that the Euro-American secular psychotherapies and psychologies and approaches are not superior because there's evidence, there's solid, sound scientific evidence. They seem superior because the hegemony is a Western secular framework, right? They're not more superior than Islamic teachings or other kind of Eastern teaching, because in the globalized world we live in, it's a secular worldview, right? So all of these things, I think, is really important for us to understand. The issue about, the work that you're doing, it is important for us to understand that people go for different emotions, people go for different desires and feelings, right? And these are, God will not hold people accountable because certain people have, desires and whatnot. Yes, they have to control it, right? And they need support to controlling it, but they're still Muslims. God still loves them, right? It's a test. And we know from the hadith, that Allah tests those whom He loves, right? It's a test, right? People might not see. I have a lot of people say, I'm going through a lot of tests, and I mentioned this, and they try and say, I don't feel loved, right? And I have a conversation, and I demonstrate and show how God still loves them, right? So, the work that you're doing is really vital, as I said. I'm not a specialist in this area, right? But I've done some studies and reading. But I thought it's important for us to mention this because, what is happening, what is going to happen, unfortunately, in the UK, if, the whole discussion about conversion therapy, the way it's defined, the way the bill has been proposed in Parliament, in England, in Scotland, and in Wales, Northern Ireland, I believe also, right? It's very chilling. If it passes, right? We know in Australia, in Canada, how that has manifested, right? So we have to educate ourselves on this, what it is. I think many Muslims within our community, they don't know what conversion therapy is. Maybe a basic example could shed some light. The mental health industry has many institutions, like the BACP, for example. The BACP, the ethical framework, the worldview, is from a Euro-American, secular, materialistic, individualistic, empirical framework, right? And obviously their worldview, how they see a client, how they see problems, will be very different from how we as Muslims, or how we should see the world and how we should see the client or the people who are suffering, right? There was not recent, but a few years ago, I posted this in my channel. A senior accredited member of the BACP was from a Christian faith. I can't remember her name, right? A journalist posed as a client, and the journalist essentially said, "Look, I've got these, feelings, right?" And what all she did, as far as I've read, is that she did what any therapist in any modality, any approach, we have over 300 approaches, modalities, they say, right? In any modality, you would do the same, right? Listen to the client. yeah, giving autonomy to the client, right? Just because of that, right? She was barred from the BACP. She didn't do anything extraordinary, right? You know the case from the
Exactly,
example.
and it's what you said earlier of any attempt to challenge the ideology in which these things are set in, or any critique of the ideology in this sense, the BACP, and hence the work you're doing with AIMS, for example, having an Islamic body, professional membership body, is so much important, because I think
Yeah.
it's there is this almost they say diversity, but they're not diverse. They will not allow any type of diversity in thinking in a different, and this is it's not at a academic level. This is at a religious level. So you have a whole body of people who disagree with the type that they're doing, and yet they still enforce, instead of saying this person comes from a different worldview, they just say, no, you must believe in our worldview, and if you don't, you're out.
Definitely, and that's the crux of it. That's why we must, as a Muslim community, develop, authentic institutions. What I mean by that is that, again, who, what, and how, right? That's why, some of us, we've developed aims, right? There are others, right? But again, this is obviously I'll be biased. I've looked at it, I've researched it. I've been in this area for 10, 15 years now, right? I feel that, we some of us who've developed it have that Islamic background grounding, as well as the psychology and counseling grounding. And we've developed a kind of ethical Islamic framework, right? It's work in progress, but we developed ethical framework. We spent a lot of resources in developing the platform, right, to help Muslim psychotherapists, psychologists, and counselors, as well as people looking for the right support. Because I have clients and people refer, right, where they go to Muslim therapists, right? Not all, but a lot of them, and some of them, they apparently say they're doing Islamic counseling. When the clients come and say, look, I've got more problems now, right? I didn't see any Islam, and a lot of the courses that are called Islamic counseling, right? Like, a number of courses, anything that all that is Islamic that they're doing is like saying Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, and that's it. But it's based on the CPCAB, and you can't go against. You can't, right? You have to stick to that, right? The only Islamic thing that they do is maybe dua and Surah Fatiha and Bismillah, and that's it. Because I've attended one of them. I know what I'm talking about, right? Because I wanted to research and say, what is this Islamic counseling, right? So again, I think that's misleading, right? That's misleading, and that's doing disservice to Islam. So that's why we need to given what is coming, the conversion therapy issue, and inshallah, we will be with your, obviously with your support, developing a guidance and to educate the Muslim community, inshallah, soon. Hopefully, it does not pass the way it's been proposed, inshallah. But if it does, then we have to be prepared how we can navigate around that, and how we can, support people who need help, right? The whole discussion about conversion therapy, I mean, a lot of studies has been done, right? It's not based on science again, right? The government, they had a committee, and the researchers, right? They excluded all the studies that went against their assumptions. So, and the studies that they used, right? They misinterpreted those studies. So it's not a scientific endeavor, right? It's ideological and it's political. And what I want to leave with is that psychology, psychological problems are real, definitely. People suffer, right? We all suffer. But the way we frame it, the way we conceptualize it, right? That's the difference between Islamic and non-Islamic. I believe that the mental health campaigns, the mental health awareness, the more we talk about mental health, the way it's been done, the more problem we will have. We are unconsciously, perhaps, right, unknowingly, unintentionally creating more problems when talking about mental health, when talking about when doing campaigns, the way it's been done. Again, everything I've said, I'm saying, even not non-Muslims are saying, right? Like people who are secularists who are saying. So when people are listening now, people are watch it later, right? It is not a Molvi, although my background is Sharia. Molvi is a derogatory term some people use, right? It's not a Molvi. This is someone who has, extensively studied and is studying these areas, right? The problems are not, I'm not talking about this from the Islamic perspective, right? These are non-Muslims, right? In psychiatry, Joanna Moncrief, for example, and large groups of psychiatrists who are making the same claims, psychologists and psychotherapists even, right? So what we need to do is maybe perhaps, work together with them, right? Yes, we may not agree with everything that they do and they say, but work with, build, collaborate with even, non-Muslims, right? We can't do it alone. How can we compete with hundreds of billions of pounds that are poured in psychiatry research? Tens and hundreds of billions of pounds have been poured in research, right, in the last 30 years to find the biomarker for depression. They have not found it. Hundreds of billions. Since 1980 to up until now, 2019, something like that, right? In the UK alone, over 600 billion or 700 billion pounds was spent on mental health, right? And tens and billions of pounds, tens of hundreds of billion pounds was spent into research. I believe that most of the research is a waste of time and money. It's like the analogy I give is like the arms industry. The corporations and companies, right? They profit from selling arms to countries. So the more wars they have, the more profit they have. The more people we can diagnose are mentally ill. The more people we can prescribe antidepressants to, the more pills that we can give to, which benefits the pharmaceutical companies and their shareholders. So of course, they want this to continue. They want people to be sick. Being sick is profitable, right? So it's a capitalist endeavor. So how do we compete with that? It's very, very difficult. But we compete with it by being genuine, by being authentic, by being sincere, by really caring for people, right? By being there for people, right? And learning and providing sound knowledge, right? I know there are many people are doing that, alhamdulillah. The more people need to speak out, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum. I know we've discussed a lot of different things. I hope it was useful.
It was very useful, and I know some of you would like to ask questions, but we don't have time. How can
we can probably take one or two
if someone does have a question, but how can people contact you, Sheikh, now if people want to contact you?
Okay, my website is down at the moment, but inshallah in the next couple of weeks it will be up. But I've got a Telegram. It's a public Telegram group, a channel, not a group, channel called Muslim Psychologist. I think you shared a slide. So I share resources, right? I've probably shared over 300 to 400 books on psychology and science and psychiatry, right? And articles and discussions, alhamdulillah, right? So I would encourage people, if you do have Telegram, to go on it, inshallah. The more people can educate, right? Everything I've said, right? It's in the resources, it's in the Telegram channel, inshallah. So yeah, you can contact me through that channel, inshallah. And hopefully when my website is done, I'll post it on my Telegram channel, inshallah.
No, inshallah. And thank you so much, because I know you have to go, and you've opened up our minds to this paradigm. And I like what you said about decolonizing, using that word, because we have this perception that because it's, from not us, and we don't empower ourselves. We don't empower the tradition. We don't empower the hadith. We don't empower the Quran, and we don't empower ourselves to create a completely different approach, which is rooted within our faith. We're not saying we're throwing away what is good, but allowing
there are a lot of good out there. There's a lot of good out there.
And it's enabling ourselves to take a different view. And I think what you're doing with the PCSB program is amazing. And I've seen the reviews, and I've seen so many people comment, so many moms, so many social workers, very leaders in the community. So may Allah.
So we have a diverse student group. Even doctors are there, psychologists are there, imams, students.
And it's all online, so you can go
online,
on your pace. I'm guessing you can go on your pace in terms of the learning. So it's a fantastic platform. I do encourage people who are here to definitely give it a view. And if you're very interested in the discussion where we have, which is a little bit of a paradigm shift, maybe for people who are learning it the first time, to look into it, and inshallah, and research it. But may Allah continue to bless you. Thank you so much for giving your time and your support to our cause as well. Inshallah, we continue to pray for you and continue to work with you in the future, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for the invite. May Allah bless you, keep you safe, and keep all of the listeners and viewers safe, inshallah, and protect us from all harms. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us to what is always pleasing to Him, not only ourselves, but also to Him, inshallah. So until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.